Vocês conhecem aqui bastante a atividade do canal, sabem que, como tem essa modinha de react, muita gente às vezes pergunta: Daniel, você viu tal coisa? Qual a tua opinião sobre tal filme, série, jogo, etc e tal? Eu resolvi fazer uma coisa um pouco diferente que tem a ver com o canal, mas também tem a ver com tudo que a gente gosta aqui. Eu quero começar a fazer alguns vídeos de react, sim, mas eu gosto muito de documentários e vídeos que mostram outros autores trabalhando. Como eu sei que é um assunto do nosso agrado, eu pretendo, sim, assistir alguns documentários aqui e você vai poder ver. Eu não vou fazer react de trailer, não pretendo, sabe? Tem que ser alguma coisa muito pontual para fazer isso. A meta aqui é o quê? Fazer de documentários, fazer de vídeos mostrando o processo artístico, talvez algumas animações. Mas eu não pretendo fazer esses reacts que tu sempre vai ver por aí. Se rolar alguma coisa assim, tem que ser muito solicitado, sabe? E essa questão da solicitação é justamente porque os apoiadores do canal, que tem uma das categorias de apoio que é o vote e participe, né? Eles me ajudaram a escolher esse documentário. Eu botei 2 documentários na jogada, esse foi escolhido. A reação do trailer, ninguém merece, mas assim, é que todo mundo faz isso. Todo mundo faz. E hoje em dia tu sabe que trailer é cilada. Então vamos fazer aqui um react escolhido dos apoiadores do canal, que é o Jack Kirby Storyteller. Só pra falar rapidamente desse documentário, até deixa eu ver se tá bem configurado aqui pra não ter problema. Ele não é um documentário recente, e ele no caso trabalha, né, com o legado do Jack Kirby dentro da indústria dos comics, entrevistando vários dos autores. Inclusive tem o Neil Adams, John Romita Sr., temos o Jim Lee, o Barry Windsor Smith, um monte de gente perguntada a respeito do Jack Kirby. Tem roteiristas também, tem o Len Wein, Merv Wolfman, entre tantos outros. E aí a gente vai assistir junto. Eu pretendo fazer algumas observações também, né? Porque eu não vejo esse documentário faz bastante tempo, então vai ter algumas coisas que eu não tô lembrando aqui que eu vou acabar comentando com vocês. E aí, se eu for fazer algum comentário, eu vou parar o vídeo, comento e a gente vai seguir. Vamos começar o documentário, né?
Jack Kirby doesn't have a place in comic book history. He kind of is comic book history.
If you're wanting to paint, you look at the masters. If you want to do comic books, you look at the masters. And, you know, Jack Kirby is the master when it comes to comic books.
You really have to scratch really hard to find a truly creative person to put
Eric
up
Larson falou agora há pouquinho, quando ele tava com um pouco de cabelo ainda.
I realized that he was creating a whole specific art style to himself, that he was this great exception to the rules that seem to be on most every other comic art.
If I had never met Jack Kirby, I probably would have done that sleepwalking stuff that everybody else did.
Nobody had ever drawn comics that had quite that much
Ô, Tunani, tudo bom?
I would buy comic books according to whether or not Jack Kirby drew them.
Nobody could draw that figure.
Ó, o Barry Windsor.
Nobody.
He had no barriers. I mean, I had corners in my rooms. He didn't have corners in his rooms. His rooms were panoramas.
The shapes are so... Oh, God. Can't even look at it.
There's so much power. I mean, there's images that I can't ever get out of my head.
He's one of the absolute major
O Walter
titans
Simonson.
to do American comic books.
Even when he was doing primitive stuff, he was getting dynamics.
Olha só. Gente, aqui ó, pra vocês terem uma ideia, ó. Aqui a gente tá vendo páginas dele com o Joe Simon, né? Tu nota como o desenho do Kirby era esguio, tu tinha a arte final do Joe Simon em cima, eles bolavam muito junto. O gestual dos personagens, né, o esquema de profundidade, de planos de visão diferente, tu já tinha as páginas dos anos 40 com isso, sabe, as páginas dele. Como esse tipo de 3 dimensões, sabe, de ação pulando da página, o material dele, já desde o início que ele estava na indústria, estava rolando já, né, na síntese do desenho dele.
Primitive stuff, he was getting dynamics, he was getting stretch. When he started to hit his prime in the FF, there was mass.
You know, he could make just the simple act of one guy hitting another guy in the face look like, you know, a cosmic calamity.
That's Jack
Oh,
Kirby's action.
Bruce
Not violence,
Timm,
action.
Bruce
Big
Timm.
difference. Nowadays it's violence. When Jack did it, it was action.
He invented all this
Oh,
stuff
Gene Lee.
that people just used years, decades afterwards.
And it changed comics. It changed the industry. It certainly changed Marvel. And then Marvel changed the
Cara, isso
industry.
aqui eu vi a arte
Industry
original.
Years, decades.
Changed
Isso
Marvel.
aqui, cara.
Changed
Essa
comics.
arte aqui.
It changed the
Tinha
industry.
no
It certainly changed.
Sindicato dos Ilustradores dos Estados Unidos lá. Foi em 2018 que eu fui. Gustavo Borges é testemunha. Fiquei emocionado no museu lá. Eu preciso botar desse tamanhinho na tela, tá? Espero que vocês entendam por uma questão de
You
copyright.
could draw like Jack, but you couldn't think like Jack. Very few people in the world ever could think like Jack.
He said, I'm a cartoonist.
And he was very proud of that.
Isso aí é uma coisa também que tem alguns que não sabem. Ali no período dos anos 40, 50, 60, né, os quadrinhos não eram vistos como uma profissão assim, ilibada, uma coisa, uma elevação artística. Era uma leitura fugaz para muitas pessoas. E os cartunistas, eles eram justamente os autores de quadrinhos, né, de tiras, que trabalhavam para os jornais e eram tipo o objetivo profissional de muitos ilustradores novatos. Tanto o Kirby quanto o Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, esses caras, eles queriam trabalhar nos jornais. Tanto o Jerry Siegel e o Joe Shuster mandaram as tiras do Superman para vários jornais, receberam várias negativas, né? E aí quando mandaram para National Periodical Comics, a DC, essas tiras viraram as páginas da Action Comics número 1. Eles precisaram rediagramar tudo. Então o próprio Kirby, ele é dessa geração que o quadrinho não era visto tanto de uma forma tão elevada de arte. Já nessa época ele preferia se chamar de cartoonist, até porque era o big plan, né, de muitos autores daquela época. Eles queriam ser os cartunistas dos jornais, né?
What he did to the art form, as well as what he represented as a person, it's a level you're given to measure up to, as well as almost an impossible challenge.
Bom,
When I was a young artist, a young aspiring artist, I didn't like Jack Kirby's work at all.
It was like a love-hate thing because on one hand, I didn't really like it. At least I didn't think I did, but I kept going back to it and I kept
ô
looking at it.
Redface, e aí, cara? Valeu, velho.
Everything real chunky and it doesn't look very realistic. And as a kid, I was like, this guy can't draw. You know, this is ugly stuff.
I would look at Kirby and I see these weird black wiggles and stuff and blocky, chunky figures. I'm like, what's up with that?
Vejam só, né? A gente havia comentado a respeito disso já em algumas lives. Notem que a primeira impressão que muitos artistas tinham quando olhavam o trabalho do Kirby pela primeira vez era esse impacto um pouco estranho, principalmente na fase Marvel ali em diante, né? Que tu tinha os dedos quadrados, os rostos angulares. É legal que tu tenha ali alguns autores comentando disso. Falamos ali do Bruce Timm, que é um autor que estiliza muito e tem essa influência dele. O Jim Lee. E agora vai vir o Neil Adams, que é um cara que quando você pensa assim, não, mas qual a conexão dos dois artistas? E é interessante que o Neil Adams sempre levou a questão de anatomia ao máximo, e agora ele vai comentar sobre isso aí, né?
Artists aren't necessarily drawn to the cruder, tougher stuff. It took an education for me to like Jack Kirby.
Keep looking back at my Kirby comics going, well, that still looks weird, but it doesn't look as weird as I remember.
And then I started going backwards, finding the other things he'd done, and just got hooked on the New Gods and the Fourth World stuff. And from there, I went backwards to see what was all this hubbub about the 60s and Marvel and Fantastic Four. And then I discovered that stuff. It just totally blew my mind.
And then it got to the point I said, you know what, maybe I'll try incorporating some of this stuff into my work. And this is before I was a professional. It's like, and then you realize, wait, you know that black squiggly line? That's his kneecap. I had no idea that was his kneecap. And you realize that he was abstracting it all, and then you start realizing these chunky shapes, the power that he would put in the figure. And then you look at it again and you go, wow, this feels 3D to me.
Vejam só, né? O pessoal que defende um monte, o realismo do Jim Lee, o realismo do Alex Ross. Notem que o próprio Jim Lee comenta, né, que quando ele começou a perceber que muitas vezes aquelas linhas que faziam divisões musculares, esse tipo de coisa associado com a figura dinâmica, deixava completamente em 3 dimensões o desenho. E vejam que é um consenso geral, que as pessoas acabam olhando depois, né, e acabam gostando do trabalho do Kirby, porque tem essa visão mais madura. E, inclusive, o próprio Walt Simonson fala, né, mostra um sinal de sabedoria. Quando uma pessoa fica mais velha, olha de novo e diz assim, olha, realmente isso aqui é bom, né?
Would buy comic books according to whether or not Jack Kirby drew them. And you just look, and somebody gets you a comic book and says, no, that's Gene Colan. He's okay, but I don't want that. I don't want Gene Colan's Iron Man. I want Jack Kirby's Iron Man. I would get so upset when you'd see like 3 or 4 people, Don Heck and Gene Colan, Jack Kirby all drawing a comic book. And you go, no.
Jack Kirby is more of a visceral artist. He works from the gut. It's powerful and in some ways off-putting because it makes you step back a little bit and wonder what the hell's going on here. And I was interested in drawing. I was interested in anatomy. I was interested in perspective and all these things that a young artist is interested in, and not interested in somebody who had taken all that stuff, put it in his back pocket, and then gone on to create just total action on a page.
So I didn't really like the stories by Jack Kirby because they were monsters. And then one day, and this happened because I got this thing secondhand or something, you know, it wasn't like new on the stands. I was in art school, or just entered art school. I was beginning to see a whole new world of comprehension and perception opening before me. And then I came across The Double Life of Private Strong. And everything inside was beautiful. It was a real Class A comic book. It looked like a comic book. It was colored like a comic book. It was quite well colored for once, you know. On the cover was this film strip of this character running away from me, or running sort of sideways or something like that, leaping, dropping, rolling, getting up and running again. This was one of the most remarkable pieces of comic book art I'd ever seen at that time. And it was so fluid, so beautiful, so easily done. I'm probably remembering it far better than it was, you know how things go. But it impressed me deeply, profoundly, I would say profoundly.
O Ricardo aqui acabou de comentar que quando criança ele não conseguia compreender o estilo do Kirby. E essa é a impressão que muitos estão manifestando aqui também, né?
There was a comic industry in the newspapers, and there was Hal Foster doing Tarzan and Prince Valiant. And,
o Big Deal daquela época, né? De fazer tira.
Doing Terry and the Pirates, and these were all wonderful storytelling tricks. But a whole different kind of approach had to be done in a comic book, because it was a finite story, trying to compact the story into 64 pages, but the 64 pages generally were more than one feature. So the comic book had to be a different identity.
He knew that for what he wanted to do, he had to develop his own style because he had to work so fast. That was the other thing. He was in a medium that required, you know, a book a week.
Aspectos interessantes ali, né? O Romita Sênior comenta justamente sobre como esse big deal, né, de trabalhar com tiras acabava se manifestando muito na produção dos autores de quadrinhos da época, e eram poucos os que conseguiam pensar a página de quadrinhos como uma página de quadrinhos, porque geralmente quando eles pensavam nessa página, autores que estavam muito relacionados com a produção de tiras, era tudo murinho de tijolo, né? Os quadrinhos sem terem painéis com tamanhos diferentes, com diagramações um pouco mais elaboradas, e o Kirby mesmo justamente começa a criar essa identidade, e está sendo falado aqui justamente isso, né, de que ele sistematizou o desenho dele para ficar mais rápido, né, para ficar mais sintético e ganhar em produção, né.
That was the other thing. He was in a medium that required, you know, a book a week, maybe sometimes two books a week. Who knows, you know, depending on the company, and especially in the 40s when they were really turning that stuff out.
You know, people used to always say how fast Jack was, and they used to marvel at that. And Jack was very fast, but his amazing lifetime output was at least as much a product of his being willing to sit at the drawing board.
Quem tá falando é o Mark Vanier, caso vocês não saibam, o Evanier trabalhou junto com o Kirby na época que ele morava, já estava na Califórnia, e o Evanier trabalhava muito com a revisão dos diálogos do Quarto Mundo e tudo mais, e para quem não sabe, o Mark Vanier é uma das maiores autoridades sobre o Jack Kirby, até porque trabalhava junto com ele no estúdio, e o Evanier é o criador, junto com o Sérgio Aragonés, do Gru, o Errante. Né? O Ricardo comentou aqui sobre a sistematização do Romitinha, do Miller, né, para tornar a produção mais rápida, é verdade.
All day and all night.
You know, they got page rates. Depending on the amount of work you turned out, that's how much money you made.
He would go to the drawing table around noon every day, and he would just sit there until about 4 the next morning and just draw, and he didn't take vacations, and he didn't take days off.
You know, my father worked a lot, so he was basically a workaholic.
A filha mais nova.
You know, you work to make a living, you work to support your family, and the fact that he was an artist doing that really didn't make a difference.
Because he had such a poor background. I grew in the projects of the Lower East Side. They had nothing. He lived in a tenement, and his parents were immigrants from Austria. And I think for him, it was just really important that we were not going to live that way.
Jack was born on August 28th, 1917, in the part of New York where you had to use your fist to defend yourself if you were short.
It was very rough. It was just like he always used to say that he portrayed his childhood just like the R gang comedies that were on TV, just exactly like that. They had their street gangs, but their street gangs were very kind of ethnic, you know, the Jewish guys in one block and the Irish guys and the Italian guys, and they'd get into their fist fights and whatnot, but that was it, you know, not quite what it's like today. But his parents, he had a very close family, and primarily Orthodox Jewish on the Lower East Side, and they were, you know, very close, very loving, and, you know, he always helped to try to take care of the family.
And the tenements had these long hallways that were very dark, and Jack got a hold of some charcoal or something, and I guess he was about 8 years old, and he just drew on that whole wall, just some outer space fantasy that he had.
And, you know, the landlord went up to his mom and, you know, Jackie's in trouble again, and did you see what he did? And she went out there and looked, and of course was like, oh, I can't believe he did this. But what he did to her was like, wow, I can't believe my kid did this kind of.
Não sei se vocês sabem, tem o Kirby Museum, e lá em Nova York eles fazem um tour, né, no Lower East Side. Então, assim, caso você venha viajar para os Estados Unidos, seja na época da Comic Con, mas geralmente é perto do aniversário do Kirby que eles fazem esse tour, né? Que é ali em agosto, né? Eles fazem um tour pelo Lower East Side e acessam justamente esse prédio, foi onde ele morou, que ele desenhava nas paredes, né? Na escadaria do prédio, tudo. Agora, eu acho que eles costumam fazer lives, inclusive, sobre essas visitações, né? Então, fiquem sabendo, rola isso aí também, né? Às vezes. É promovido pelo Kirby Museum, visitando a vizinhança onde o Kirby viveu quando criança.